So Donald Trump just walked into a Ford plant in Michigan, looked straight at the North American trade deal he negotiated, called it irrelevant, and then flipped off a worker who dared to call him out. Let's be honest here. That finger wasn't just aimed at one guy on the line, it was a message to Canadian workers too.
Because when he shrugs at CUSMA and says Americans don't need Canadian products, he's not just threatening auto jobs in Windsor, he's messing with beef in Alberta, canola in Saskatchewan, lumber in BC, aluminum and dairy in Quebec, and seafood in the Atlantic. And the tax base that pays for hospitals and schools in every province and territory.
And in the middle of all that, you've got Ontario Premier Doug Ford telling us not to let Trump ruin your life and to keep traveling to support our American friends on the same week a US president is calling our trade deal irrelevant.
Meanwhile, while Trump's flipping off workers in Michigan, Prime Minister Carney is flying to Beijing and then on to Europe and next month India, trying to make sure Canada doesn't get dragged down just because one guy in Washington wants to control the whole hemisphere.
From up here, this week looked a lot like one thing: the US threatening the deal that keeps our economy breathing, and Canada quietly getting ready to fight back.
So let's start with CUSMA, or the USMCA as they call it in the United States. What does it mean? Well, this isn't some abstract acronym. It is actually why factories in Ontario exist, why the US and Canadian parts can cross the border without getting hammered by tariffs. When you kneecap the underlying agreement, you don't just hurt the guy on the hard hat, you hurt the accountant, the truck dispatcher, the software development, the person doing customs and paperwork. And it smashes a lot of American communities too, not just Michigan and US border states. US farmers have been very open about this. Even though they were Trump's biggest supporters, they now realize that they need stable access to Canadian and Mexican markets. Their corn, soy, beef, dairy, all of it roots through this framework.
Same with the US manufacturing outside of auto: chemicals, machinery, aerospace, energy, tech. A lot of those sectors have integrated supply chains that hop the border. A component made in Quebec or Ontario becomes part of a product that's assembled in New York, then maybe shipped back to Canada again. If every crossing turns into a tariff roulette wheel, US plants shut down or move, just like ours do.
And then there's the part no one sees on a factory tour: services. Financial services, logistics, insurance, tourism, consulting, digital stuff. All of that rides on the back of trade flows.
So yeah, we're talking about Ford because that's where Trump decided to flip off a worker and call the USMCA irrelevant. But if he actually follows through and lets this thing rot in the 2026 review, well, you're going to feel it whether you're in Rimouski, Whitehorse, or downtown Toronto.
And that's what makes his whole act so weak. He's trying to look untouchable on that catwalk while he's standing on a network that keeps his own country running. The tariffs, the threats, the "I don't care if it expires" line, those aren't aimed at just us. They bounce back and hit his own voters square in the face.
And if he wants to keep calling it irrelevant while his own industries beg him to keep it, fine. Canada's job is to make sure that when he finally realizes he torched the furniture, we're not the ones stuck in the smoke.
So before we move on to what our Prime Minister is doing, let's talk about the auto industry for a second. He's already slapped 25% tariffs on vehicles and parts coming in from Canada and Mexico under his old law called Section 232. He claimed that imported autos are a national threat, and he did the same thing with steel and aluminum.
Meanwhile, cars coming from overseas partners like Japan and Europe can face lower rates in some categories. So the incentive structure literally starts to reward shipping a product across an ocean instead of having it built with North American steel, North American workers, and North American parts, meaning American people, not just Canadians, get hurt.
And the people calling that out aren't just Canadian politicians. His own auto industry is lined up in Washington going, please don't destroy the one agreement that actually works. Ford, GM, Stellantis, Toyota, Tesla, Honda, all the big players have been telling his trade office the same thing. This deal is crucial for U.S. auto production. It saves tens of billions of dollars through North American integration, and ripping it up would be a disaster.
Oh, and then Volkswagen walked in and took the gloves off. They filed a public comment saying in plain language that Trump's 25% tariffs on Mexican and Canadian auto goods violate binding commitments the U.S. made under the USMCA. And while Trump is shrugging and saying that he doesn't really care if USMCA survives, Ford CEO is in Detroit telling reporters the agreement is critical for the auto sector. He wants changes around the edges, sure, but he's very clear that this integrated North American system is how they keep vehicles even remotely affordable and keep those plants running.
Meanwhile, we've got our Ontario Premier Doug Ford making no sense at all and urging Canadians to cross the border and support our friends in Michigan, when he just last month said he's not going to Florida. Now he says, we love Americans, Americans love Canadians, and it's just one guy causing trouble, which sounds warm and fuzzy until you realize that that one guy is the one trying to ruin our economy, and the only leverage Canadians have is to boycott the USA, boycott American products, and speak out against that regime.
Yeah, sure. Let's cross the border and support a government raising tariffs, threatening jobs from Halifax to Winnipeg, and creating an environment where ICE feels empowered and unchecked at the border. Sounds like a great idea to me. When we said support our American friends in a video earlier this week, that is not at all what we meant. We didn't mean drive to Michigan, buy a bunch of stuff, and pretend none of this is happening. We meant support the people, like that Ford worker who stood there on the line and said what millions are thinking, and maybe even contribute to his GoFundMe page.
Amplify voices and share their stories and support the journalists, the lawyers, the organizers that are fighting back, the people on the ground who are trying to keep institutions honest.
And I know some people will say, but come on, it was just a gesture, and everyone swears. No, context matters. This wasn't Trump swearing in private. This was a president on camera in a workplace where people are scared about jobs and tariffs, aiming that gesture at a guy who dared to say out loud what the president just didn't want to hear.
Listen, if you're confident in your choices, you answer the criticism. You explain why you're right. If your go-to move is to insult a worker and flip him off, that's not strength, that is complete insecurity.
Now, Trump supporters call him the man of the people. Here's a man of the people for you. The guy on the line who knows he might lose his job but still shouts the truth and accepts the suspension because he refuses to be quiet.
So you've got Trump on one side saying, we don't need cars made in Canada, we don't need cars made in Mexico, and we'll just do it all ourselves. And then you've got the actual company saying, if you rip this up or make this even more chaotic, prices are going to go up, jobs are going to get lost, and you're going to weaken the very industry you claim to be protecting.
And if you live in Canada, this is where the anxiety really kicks in because, we've been here before. Tariffs on steel, tariffs on aluminum, sudden threats against lumber, copper, agriculture, you name it. And every time we're told, don't worry, the deal will hold.
And to be fair, the agreement has shielded a lot of Canadian and Mexican exports so far. When the most recent 25% tariff came in on Canadian and Mexican imports, the CUSMA compliant goods were initially exempted.
Now, here's where I think this exposes his weakness big time. A strong position would be, this deal is working for us, but here's what we want improved. Instead, he says, I don't care if it lives or dies. While his own automakers, suppliers, and trade associations are flooding Washington with letters saying, please don't blow this up. And for the love of sanity, stop hitting us with extra tariffs on top of it.
It's no wonder he's bankrupted every company he's ever touched. Now he's going to bankrupt a country. But in the middle of all this circus, you've got our Prime Minister Mark Carney flying into Beijing, then on to Qatar, and then Europe, and then next month, India. He's trying to make sure Canada doesn't get dragged down just because one guy in Washington wants to control the entire hemisphere.
Yeah, he's in China right now with one of the biggest Canadian delegations we've seen in years, trying to reset a badly damaged relationship and find new markets for our products.
The timing is not an accident either. Between Trump's tariffs, his invasions, and the constant threats against our exports, it's obvious that Canada cannot keep treating the U.S. as a stable, predictable partner.
That doesn't mean China is suddenly our best friend. Their record on trade coercion is ugly. We've seen what they did to Australia, what they've done to Japan, And what they did to us when we arrested Meng Wanzhou on the command of the USA, I might add, and locked up the two Michaels. Now, none of that has magically vanished.
But here's the difference in approach. Trump sees Carney heading to Beijing, India, Europe, and panics, so he throws a tantrum and says, "We don't need you." Which we all know in Trump doublespeak is, "We need you, but I just don't care."
And Carney's message, it's simple. Fine. We're not going to yell or look for sound bites. We're going to go do the hard work, negotiate, make friends, and we're going to make sure that we're not trapped.
Carney's team goes into Beijing knowing that 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs triggered Chinese tariffs on our canola and other agricultural goods. Western farmers have been sitting on mountains of seeds while Chinese buyers switch to European or Australian suppliers. And that needs to change.
Which is really going to annoy Ontario's auto sector because Doug Ford has already said that he's totally opposed to easing up on Chinese EV tariffs. He wants Chinese manufacturers to build plants here if they want access, which I personally think is a good idea. Even though I really never trust Ford's reasoning, I'll take it when he has a good one.
But here's the strategic piece. By even having this conversation, Canada is signaling to Washington that we're no longer a captive supplier. If Trump wants to weaponize CUSMA, if he wants to threaten to walk away from the agreement that his own auto industry loves, Canada is prepared to build new outlets for its trade.
And in a strange way, every time Trump ramps up these threats, he strengthens the case for Canadian diversification. He gives Prime Minister Carney the perfect argument to talk to Beijing, Delhi, Brussels, wherever he goes next. You can deal with a Canada that honors its agreements and offers stability, or you can ride the roller coaster in Washington.
And here's the question that always comes up at the end of one of these videos. What can Canadians actually do about this? Because it's one thing to watch Trump wave off CUSMA from a catwalk in Michigan. It's another thing to push back in a way he'll actually feel.
And this is where we do not listen to Doug Ford. He can tell people to keep going to Michigan all he wants, but we don't have to. The most powerful thing Canadians have right now is choice. We can choose not to line up at U.S. border crossings while Americans are getting tear gassed, detained, and flipped off by their own government. We can choose not to pretend everything is normal.
Every trip we don't take, every hotel we don't book, every outlet mall we skip, that's lost revenue in districts where mayors, governors, Congress members, and senators start asking, what happened to the Canadians? And eventually that lands exactly where it needs to, on the desk of the guy who keeps treating allies like punching bags.
And at home, we can put that money to work right here. Buy Canadian whenever you can. If you're going to buy a car, buy one that's built in Canada. You know, a lot of those American brands still have plants in Ontario, so you can support the workers on this side of the border without rewarding the government that just called their trade deal irrelevant.
And while you're at it, send a note to your MP and your provincial government and say, if we're going to take trade seriously, then drop the interprovincial barriers and get our own house in order. There's no point begging Washington for access while we're still tripping over our own red tape between provinces.
So, if you're angry about Trump flipping off a worker in Michigan and shrugging at CUSMA, don't just stew in it. Keep your tourism dollars at home. Fill your pantry with Canadian products. Back Canadian workers and Canadian factories. And push Ottawa and the provinces to finally fix internal trade and build those damn major projects.
That's how you hit them where it actually hurts. Money and political pressure. Not with a hashtag, but with quiet choices that add up. Less cash flowing south, more investment staying here. More local jobs, more resilience, more independence. And if you're watching this from the US, I would say listen to your auto workers, your suppliers, your engineers, your small businesses. They're the ones calling CUSMA, or when you call it USMCA, essential. They're the ones warning about tariffs being pushed under this national security label. They're the ones saying, extend this agreement. Don't blow it up.
So, the next time Trump says Canada is irrelevant or that his agreement is irrelevant, just remember, the companies that keep the lights on in Detroit, they don't agree with him. The people who spent billions building an integrated North American auto industry, they don't agree with him.
Up here, it's simple. We see it pretty clearly. One leader is out there trying to blow up a working trade system, shielding his friends and attacking his critics and allies. The other is on a plane to China and India trying to make sure Canada has options when the neighbor completely loses the plot.
And that's why we keep hammering this point home. The real divide is not between Canadians and Americans, it's between people who want functioning institutions and people who think power is just a chance to flip off anyone who gets in their way.
So let us know in the comments how you see it. If you live near an auto plant or if you work in the industry, if you remember what it was like before we had this kind of integrated trade, we'd love to hear your take.
And we'll keep following both stories. Trump trying to tear things down for the cameras, and Canada trying to build things that last.
And if you're new here, we're Dave and Deb, and you can check out our Substack for a more in-depth and spicier version of our videos that we can't say here on YouTube.
And if you want to help support this channel so we can keep doing this every single day, consider joining the A-Team. That's the behind-the-scenes look at what goes on here at the Planet D Politics.
All the links are below where you can also check out our merch and join our Facebook page. We will see you tomorrow, everybody.
Thanks for watching. Ciao for now.